we spent chapter 4 talking about the American Revolution, seeing those what were once colonies fight and eventually win their independence from Great Britain. And so now what we want to do is look at the political structure then, and how do they go about making that independence, or turning just the idea of independence into a functioning government. How do they go about governing that new nation? It's one thing to, fight for independence and win independence and all those kind of things, but it's completely different for them to govern themselves and start acting like a country, like a nation. So, of course, what we're building to here is the writing of the Constitution, and we're going to talk a lot about that and how it was written and why it was written and different problems that came with writing it and all those different kind of things. But first, we have to look at what came before the Constitution, which a lot of folks may not even realize that the Constitution was not the first form of government that the United States had. There was another form of government that came before the Constitution that only lasted about 10 years because it did not work very well at all, and things started to fall apart very, very quickly, ultimately resulting in this first form of government being thrown out and the Constitution being written in its place. So it was the Constitution that has governed the United States for more than 200 years now, was the plan B. It was the second option because the first one, again, didn't do very well. So today we're going to focus on this first attempt at a national government, and mainly on the things that it didn't do well, but we will also start by looking at, there's really one area where it did a pretty good job. So let's talk about this first form of government, and you've already seen this word a couple of times here about a confederation. And so we call this time when this government was in place the Confederation period, and that refers to this time where the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation, this was the first national government that the United States had. Think of it as kind of like a first constitution. This was the first thing that they made before we made the Constitution, the document known as the Articles of Confederation that sets up this Confederation government. So this was done, we're kind of going backwards a little bit here, backtracking. This was done not too long after independence. Independence is declared, July 1776. And, from that point on, they're acting as an independent nation. So at that point, they're saying, okay, we're not colonies anymore, we've got to have a new government. So the Second Continental Congress actually drafts this Articles of Confederation, and it goes into effect technically, well, not technically, but sort of de facto immediately, although it's approved by the state several years later. Now, the Articles of Confederation, this creates a very weak central government. It is a very weak, very loose central government to unite these former colonies, now they are states, together. And that's not an accident, okay? The fact that it's a confederation is something specific. It creates a kind of government that is called a confederation. And this is something in the past we would have seen an example of this when we talked about Native Americans, but I took it out this year for time and different things. But the idea here, a confederation, it means, just what I said, it means a weaker central government. It means a loose alliance. If you have a loose alliance with someone, that means, you're aligned maybe for some things, usually for mutual protection. It's usually like for defensive purposes, but it doesn't mean that we're the same thing. We're still our own person. We're still our own country. We still make our own rules. We still do our own thing. But we are united for some kind of common purpose, again, usually defense. The idea here, this first of all is more like how they behave as colonies. Still individual entities, 13 individual states that are just kind of working together for purposes of protection is sort of the idea. They also get this idea from Native Americans, Native American confederations like the Iroquois, that were, individual tribes with their individual governments and their individual languages and their individual cultures, but they would be united together, particularly for, purposes of fighting. They all work together as one when they needed to defend themselves. That's the idea here. So it creates a loose union of states. So each state is still completely independent to do what they want to do for the most part. They're not getting rid of the fact that this is Virginia and this is Pennsylvania and this is New York and so forth. They're just creating a central government that unites them all for a couple of things. Really, it's kind of a continuation of the Second Continental Congress. Okay, so let me, before I get to that. So it's a loose union of states, it's a confederation, it's an intentionally weak central government, and that central government is made up of a one-house Congress, and that's it. So just a one-house or a one-chamber Congress, all of the states represented equally in that Congress. So it's a one-chamber Congress, every state represented equally. So every state has the same number of delegates, from the really small states to the really big states. Keep that in mind, because we will talk later about how some states don't like that. So essentially, it is basically just a continuation of the Second Continental Congress. It's basically saying that the Second Continental Congress, lasts indefinitely, and it authorizes that government, to be the official government of the new United States. So the same sort of structure they were operating under before, it just adds legitimacy to it and all of that. So we have a weak central government, made up of this one-house Congress. Now let's talk about what kind of powers this Congress had. In other words, what kind of things this government was able to do, and that will give us an understanding not only just of that, but what these the people that created this, what they saw as the purpose of this central government that they're creating, why they thought they needed a central government like this. Okay? Some of the things, and we're not going to list all the powers of Congress, obviously, but some of the big ones. Things like they can declare war. They can raise an army. They can make treaties. Borrow money. So some of those things, declare war, make treaties, raise an army, all of that, you notice that what do those powers really all kind of relate to? Specifically what function? What do they all kind of have in common if we're talking about raise money, make treaties, declare war, raise an army? What does it suggest they thought this government was really for? Defense, yeah. It's stuff like, if we're attacked, if we have to defend ourselves, if we're in a war, which this is written, you have to remember, this is all done in the midst of the Revolutionary War. They are at war when they make this government. That's kind of what they saw the purpose of it to be. But other kinds of things, other kind of day-to-day governing, this Congress does not have the power to deal with. All that kind of stuff is left up to the individual states. So other kinds of laws, any other kind of just day-to-day business, that is left up to the individual states to handle. Again, that was the way it always was under the colonies. This is kind of a very new idea still to them, to have some kind of a central government that has authority over all of the colonies, all the states rather. So in a moment, we will get to what some of those things are that were left to the states that ended up causing a lot of problems, and some of the weaknesses of this system. Because mostly when we think about the Articles of Confederation, and after today, when you think of the Articles of Confederation, you will probably more think about its failures, the things that it did not do well, the powers that they did not equip this government with, and how that created chaos and created a situation where the United States really could not govern itself. However, there is one particular area that stands alone as kind of being the one thing that this Articles of Confederation government was able to do very well, where they both equipped this government with the tools and the teeth to be able to handle something, and where they actually did something really, really well that lasted far beyond the Articles of Confederation itself, and that had to do with Western land. So in administering and dealing with and organizing Western land, setting up policy for the Western territories, this is the one place the Articles of Confederation did in fact do a good job. So let's first talk about what do we mean by Western land. Think about Treaty of Paris, 1783, the one that ended the Revolution. What land did the new United States get? That's right. So all that land to the Mississippi River, okay, all that land to the Mississippi. So all that land between, look at my map here. Here's your sort of natural border of your 13 states, and here's the Mississippi. So basically all of this, where Alabama is, where the, Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, all of that would have been the West when you're talking about this particular period. When people talked about the West, they didn't mean California, they meant what would today be Illinois or someplace like that. But all that land and how to organize it and how do we set it up so that it can be settled, what do we do with it, who is in charge of it, those are big questions that there were not easy answers to. So for one thing, that you had an immediate problem with all of that, in that numerous states were actually claiming some of that land to belong to them. So that was the initial problem they had to deal with. But you have squabbling states arguing and fighting each other, or not physically fighting, but fighting verbally, over some of that territory. Many, not all states, but several of them were claiming, some of them ridiculous amounts of that land, saying that it was theirs, saying that it was part of Virginia or it was part of New York. They're basing this off of some of their original colonial charters that never really had an exact, location of exactly where their western border was. And so they're saying, no, when they just want to extend their borders as far westward, there's some parts of that area that were actually being claimed by like 3 states all at once. So that was the first thing they had to deal with was, how do we get the states to stop fighting about that? And they eventually do. So that's one way they were successful, is they are able to convince the states somehow or another to stop fighting over all that land and to basically surrender it to the national government. So they're able to basically say that all of this territory does not belong to any of the existing states. It is not part of any of the existing states. It is basically going to be under the control of the national government, of this central government. They're going to control it for now. And then they're going to go about setting up policy, setting up a plan. Okay, now that we know this is not Virginia, it's not Pennsylvania, it's not any of that, they set up a policy or a plan of how it's going to be settled and how those areas might eventually become states, because they're not states yet. So there's 2 major laws that they pass. One of them we're going to look at in more detail than the other. But these both have to do with that Western territory, and these are both considered to be some of the greatest accomplishments of the Confederation Congress. So again, this is still about land policy, Western land policy. The first one is called the Land Ordinance of 1785. This one we're not going to look at in as much detail. Basically, what the Land Ordinance of 1785 did was it set up a process of how this land, or a plan of how this land would be divided and sold. So how the land would be divided up and sold. And you'll read about it more, but it creates a nice little organized pattern where they're going to divide it up into these like grids and, plots of land of equal size and sell it off, to individual settlers. And it gets specific about that, about how that's going to be done. But the reason why that's important and kind of what they did here that ended up being kind of what their thought process was, they wanted the land to be divided up into, plots that would be sort of, I guess I want to say affordable. They didn't want some rich landowner going out there and just claiming huge tracts of land, and all of that land ending up being owned by, a handful of people. They saw the West as this should be open to everybody. That anybody that wants to get land out there ought to be able to afford it. That we need to make sure this land is, obtainable by numerous people. We don't want this to become like, a bunch of just a couple of rich, wealthy landowners out there. They saw this as a more egalitarian kind of approach. So by dividing up the land into smaller pieces, they were sort of ensuring that it would be more affordable. and then it would be more even, and then it would be more fair, and it would be more organized, and all that kind of stuff. So you wouldn't have people just rushing out there and claiming big tracts of land that belong to them. This would kind of provide an organized process of how that would be done. But again, part of the idea was to keep it more affordable, to make this small farms for individuals, individual settlers, make it more obtainable, so to encourage more people to go out there, because that's ultimately part of it as well, is they're trying to make this attractive. They want people to move out there, so they're trying to create a situation where people would want to do that and would be in a position financially to be able to do that. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 does a lot of the organizing. It sets up this little grid. It sort of says, this is how we're going to divide this up, and we're going to sell the land to individual people. It's not going to be sold off to private investors and stuff like that. It's going to be sold off to individual settlers. And the national government gets the money, and they're definitely going to need that. Probably considered to be the biggest accomplishment of the Confederation Congress is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. Now, the Northwest Ordinance, first of all, we talk about the Northwest, because this specifically dealt with the territory that they would have called the Northwest, that would have been the Northwest at the time. Today, people might refer to that as the old Northwest, because it's not the Northwest now. If I said we're going to go to the Northwest today, we'd be heading to Oregon or Washington State or someplace like that. But in these days, where would the Northwest have been? Remember, the western border of the United States is here. Okay. Around the Great Lakes area, so you're talking about what would today be like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, that area, okay? That's the Northwest, and this specifically dealt with that particular territory. For example, you probably heard of Northwestern University. Anybody know where it is? It's in Chicago. So that's not the Northwest now, but it was when that university was established. Okay, so that's the West for quite some time. Okay, Northwest Ordinance. Here's what this one does. A couple of things. First of all, it sets up a process for how territories or how these areas will eventually become states. It sets up a process for how these territories, how these areas, these lands, will eventually become states. So the Land Ordinance more deals with how individual people can go out there and buy some land and start a farm. This one deals with the bigger picture of, okay, once they become settled, how do they go about becoming states? And it sets up a whole process and sets up like certain numbers, like if you get to a certain number of settlers in a place, actually it starts at 5,000, then it becomes a territory. And a territory, like that's when it gets a name, like the Ohio Territory or the Michigan Territory or something like that. Being a territory is a little bit like being a colony, in that at that point you get to elect some of your own government, you get to have a territorial legislature, you get to have a territorial governor. Congress is not really ruling you anymore. The people living there get to do that, but they're not a full state yet, so they're not represented in the national government, but they do start to get some self-government at that point. Then when you get to an even bigger number of settlers, actually at 60,000, at that point they can apply for statehood. So first you're a territory for a while, and that depends, some states, years that they're territories, there are a few that it's almost, overnight. But you're a territory first, and then at a certain point you can apply for statehood. And when that's up to Congress to, accept a new state or not. But when they become a state, they are on equal footing with existing states. That's some of the exact words from this law, that they're on equal footing with existing states. Now, what does that mean, equal footing with existing states? Yes? Right, so none of the other states have any advantage over them. They don't have any advantage over any other states, particularly your original 13. What they were talking about here was they didn't want those original 13 states to become some sort of elite club, where they get to have more power or they get to have more say-so because they've been around longer. What they're saying here is that, when Michigan becomes a state or any place like that, even when they've been a state for one day, their vote and their voice and all of that counts just as much as Massachusetts and some of the other ones. That the new is not inferior to the old, and that the people living in those states don't have any less status or anything like that. It basically also protects, it promises, the Northwest Ordinance promises basic legal rights to people who move out west from the moment they move out there. Even before those areas are organized as territories, they are promised basic legal and political rights, that your rights go with you when you move out there. Once again, they want to encourage Western settlement. That's always going to be a theme of, of the United States, really, is this encouragement of Western settlement and seeing the West as a place of opportunity. We know that that's kind of a trope, it's kind of a stereotype almost of the West. So that's the place where you go, to go avoid your problems. You go out west and you find whatever, your fortune, whatever that may be. And while sometimes, it gets stereotyped, we can be silly about it, but it's the truth. And that starts probably right here. And really, you could argue it even starts before that, and that's from the beginnings of colonization, But certainly, with this Northwest Ordinance, they are certainly creating this image of the West being sort of this place of freedom, because not only was there all this land, and it's they're putting it in affordable pieces and all this kind of stuff, but by promising basic rights would be protected, that you weren't leaving that behind, that just puts no limits on westward expansion. And the other thing is, to us, that probably just makes total sense, and it probably doesn't sound like it's all that revolutionary or it's all that exciting. But at the time, it really and truly was. You have to realize, again, these people just a few years before this were colonies. They were the ones who left and went somewhere else. They were the ones that went to the new. Did they feel like their rights were always protected when they went to the new? No. So this is turning the whole, notion of empire on its head. This is undoing and doing, westward, doing expansion differently. They are putting an end, or wanting to put an end to this concept of inferior colonies, and that when you leave the center of society, when you leave those populated places, that you're taking a risk. But they certainly wanted to emphasize that you still maintain your citizenship and your rights and all that kind of stuff. Really, again, encouraging Western expansion and just putting a completely different spin on expansion, very unlike the European view of it, where the new was inferior to the old, and you might be giving up your rights if you went somewhere else. So they're doing something completely different there. And lastly, the Northwest Ordinance also bans slavery north of the Ohio River. So we have that whole process for statehood, promises of legal and political rights, and it also bans slavery north of the Ohio rivers. Essentially then banning slavery in this Northwest Territory. The Ohio River is, your state, the top part of Kentucky and the bottom boundary of Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. So they're basically saying from here on up, no slavery. So again, trying to keep this a region of small farms, not wealthy plantation owners and all of that, by banning slavery. And this also means it's going to very much create sort of a character and a personality for this part of the country. And here for the first time, you are going to have some of the very first states admitted eventually where slavery was never a part of it, because we know that even in those New England states, slavery had existed at one time. But here for the first time, you will have people settling there where slavery has never been a part of it. And so we will see later that the West kind of takes on a personality of being rather democratic and more egalitarian, not to say perfect, certainly not, but more of an emphasis on individual land ownership, and you could argue even things like education. The West is kind of ahead of everybody else on those sorts of things. So with Western land, the Articles of Confederation does very well because they're able to solve problems. They're able to be very forward-thinking, and they really thought beyond that moment. They weren't just saying, let's solve the problem we have now. They were saying, we know that these areas, although they are not settled yet, they're going to be. They're not ready to be states yet, but they're going to be. Let's set up a process. And that's something that would far last way beyond the Articles of Confederation, and it lasts way beyond the Northwest Territory. They didn't know in 1787 that the United States was eventually going to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. yet they set up a process that would still work for that. And so that process will continue to be used, and all of those principles continue to be used even when the United States expands beyond the Mississippi River. However, with the Articles of Confederation, like I've already said, it is really more bad than good. They actually create a recipe for disaster. It's because, once again, they wanted a weaker government, one that was the way things had already been. Also, what else was going on here, and what had been going on here, that probably made these people very nervous about creating a powerful government? They're in the middle of a war, and who are they fighting? And why are they fighting Britain? What did they feel Britain had? What was their big issue? Yeah. Yeah, they were fighting a war against a government that they felt was too powerful and had done things to abuse that power. And so it makes sense that they would create a government that wasn't very powerful. But what they end up doing is creating a government that's so weak it can't function and can't do the things that it needs to do. So we're going to look at a couple of the big oopses with this, a couple of the big problems they had, powers they didn't give this government, or structures they didn't give this government intentionally, but that caused a really big problem. One big problem they have is that this Congress, this government, does not have the power to regulate commerce between the states. So let's talk about what that means. Commerce, we look at that word commerce, what does it kind of look like? Sound like? Commercial, okay, we say that something like the commercial area, commercial district, what does that mean? Money making, okay, business, okay, commerce is a fancy word for trade. Fancy word for trade and business. Trade and business. Now, the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, they can regulate trade out of the country, but they cannot regulate trade from state to state. They can't pass any rules about it. So states are trading back and forth. Congress has no authority to make any kind of regulations about it or to generally say anything about it. So that's up to the individual states to handle. And that sounds like, okay, fine, that wouldn't be a big problem, but it's a huge problem. Mainly because the states are taxing each other. Okay, the big problem that emerges because of this is that the states are taxing each other's goods. So if I'm New York, I'm saying to Pennsylvania, well, if you want to sell some of your wheat to us, we're going to tax it. And Pennsylvania probably doesn't like that very much. They don't want taxes put on their goods because that means people won't buy it as much, doesn't it? And back and forth and back and forth. And some of them are charging outrageous prices, and they're saying you're going to use our port. They're just doing all of this stuff, you know, because that they have the authority to.
Were they doing that just to be petty, or was it something else?
It's probably more just for them to make money. I don't think it's so much, oh, we don't like you, so we're going to tax you more. However, once it gets going, then they're probably doing it in retaliation. Yeah, so some of it might not have started that way, but some of it probably became that way. They're taxing us, so we're going to tax them right back. Yes, absolutely. So the states are taxing each other, and that is leading to disputes between the states. They're arguing with each other. They're fighting with each other over the taxes. It's leading to a lot of bad blood between each of the states. And in some cases, it is so extreme where they don't actually go to war about it, but some of them are thinking about it. Some of them are making threats against each other to actually attack each other over these trade issues. So try to imagine this brand new baby country trying to establish itself, trying to get on its feet. They just, miraculously won this war against Britain, but now the states are about to erupt into civil war. So that's a pretty precarious situation. Again, Congress has no authority to do anything here. They can't step in and say, okay, you can't do that, or you have to lower your taxes. There's no court system here either for the states to solve their disputes. So they're just a bunch of bickering, squabbling states about to erupt into civil war. Another problem that they have is the fact that this Congress cannot coin money. They don't have the power to coin money. In other words, issuing money. There is no national currency under the Articles of Confederation. So if the national government, if the Congress cannot coin money, who is coining money? The individual states are. So each individual state has their own money. They have Pennsylvania money, and there's New York money, and there's South Carolina money. Everybody's doing it differently. So for one thing, that's confusing. You can imagine that's pretty darn confusing if you've got 13 different kinds of money, all with different values and different looks and things like that. That's just confusing and quite chaotic. So that's a problem. But really, why it's an even bigger problem is because the states not only are they printing their own money, but they're doing that very recklessly. They're not regulated by it. So they're printing way too much, and they're printing too much paper money. States were printing a lot of paper money, and they're printing way too much of it. Paper money, it's kind of a harder concept for us to understand because we use paper money all the time. But in these days, they didn't typically do that. Paper money was not what you usually used. It was usually gold coins and that sort of stuff, which we call hard currency. But it wasn't unusual, particularly during a crisis like a war, for example, to print paper money to kind of get you through the tough times. So that had happened during the war. You have all this paper money being printed, and now they're just cranking it out like crazy. And why would that be a problem? What would that cause? Yes? Well, it could be, printing, it could be a inflation. Yes, that's the word. This leads to a serious inflation problem. They're printing all that money without any kind of regulation, and that is leading to massive inflation. What's happening to the value of that paper money? It is basically worthless, not worth anything. And so prices are rising, and this is another thing for the states to fight about because, they're saying to each other, well, your money's no good here. It doesn't mean anything. We're not going to take it. So we've got serious inflation. We have states fighting about it. It's a very, very serious economic problem. They gave this government very little, if any, control over the economy. And that really, a lot of historians will argue that's the biggest problem. It's more of an economic one than anything else. This one is largely considered by a lot of people to probably be the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation. I think you can argue it in numerous ways, but this one usually gets put at the top of the list, and that is the fact that this government did not have the power to tax. Now, pretty obvious to us as to why they didn't want to have a government that could tax. Why do you think they did that? Right. We know that taxation is a pretty sensitive subject to these people. It still is. That's still something that we as Americans, we don't like that word. We get really mad when people start saying that word. So they certainly created a national government that couldn't do that. Well, that creates a pretty big problem, though. Why would it be a problem for the government if they don't have the power to tax? Yeah.
Because they can't build up.
They have no money. Yeah. How the governments have to have money in order to operate. And this means we have a government that's broke, that has no money. The only income they really are getting is sales from Western land, which there's a little bit coming in there, but not tons at a time. And anything off of, external trade, which just wasn't all that much either. So without the power to tax, you have a government that's nearly flat broke, that cannot function. Governments have to be able to function. And the other thing is that this government, just came out of a war. There's a significant amount of debt. There's huge amounts of debt that they owe to foreign countries, that they owe to individual states. If an individual state owes money, they got a pretty big financial problem here, and that there's a huge debt and no way to pay it off. And how does that make this new country look if they can't pay off their debts? Makes them look pretty bad. Makes them look pretty unreliable. And as many people recognized even then, was a great threat to their very independence. If we can't pay off these debts, what's to stop some of these more powerful countries from coming over here and saying that they're going to take over until we can pay our debts and all those kinds of things? So we have big economic trouble here. We also need to remember that just because the national government can't tax doesn't mean the states can. Okay, the states were taxing quite heavily in some cases, so that's going to lead to some problems as well. But they are flat broke. We said that they can raise an army, but if you've got no money, how are you going to do that? They can do all these things for defense and protection, but if you've got no money, how do you do it? So we have a bunch of squabbling states nearly fighting with each other. We have huge inflation. We have no money. The whole thing just seems like it is about to fall apart. Other kind of structural problems. These are not so much issues with powers that Congress didn't have, but just sort of almost like parts of the government that appear to be missing, or that other kind of structural, logistical things. There's no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. In other words, there's no president, or there's no executive council, there's no branch of government that you had. So with no executive, there is no really good way for Congress to make sure that the law actually gets done, that the law is actually followed. They can make certain kinds of laws. We know there's some things they can't do. They can't tax and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of the stuff that they were able to do, it really amounts to little more than just recommendations. Just we recommend that this happens. We suggest that this happens. But with no enforcement power, there is no person, there is no unit, there is no committee that it has that authority to actually make sure that something gets done. And so that means that they're pretty powerless. Their lack of power is enhanced by the fact that there's no way to really enforce it. That leads to violations of all sorts of laws and other kinds of things that cannot be implemented. But one that really sticks out as being a big problem is that the Treaty of Paris is being violated in multiple ways. And there's no way for Congress to really enforce it, and there's no executive to do that for them. And we're talking about the 83 one, of course, the one that ended the revolution. It's being violated actually on both sides. There are things that the United States is not doing. There are things that Britain is not doing. On the American side, on the United States side, debt is the biggest one. Debts are not being paid. A lot of those were debts that the individual states owed. Some of them may have even been debts that they had incurred prior to the revolution, and they're not paying them off. Again, with no power here to force the states to do that, and no way to raise money and all those kind of things. Those debts are not being paid. For the British side, there's some other things in there too. That's just kind of the big one. The big thing that was bothering people on the British side is that the British had not fully evacuated the Western territories. What does evacuate mean? To leave. The British do still have not a huge presence, but somewhat of a presence in some of those western areas we were just talking about several minutes ago. They haven't fully evacuated those. Again, it's not a gigantic presence, but it's certainly something that irks a lot of people. And keep that one in mind. That's going to continue to be a problem off and on. That will eventually be one of our underlying causes of the War of 1812. But that's, at this point, and Britain's saying, well, you're not going to pay your debts. We're not going to do what we promised either. So all of this is threatening for a number of reasons, as well as just threatening the legitimacy of this new country. We can't make good on our agreements and we can't keep our promises. That doesn't make us look like we're the real deal. It doesn't make us look like we can be trusted. There are also a couple of border disputes with a few other countries, mainly Spain. We talked about how Spain still maintains Florida. There were disputes about exactly where that border was, and a few other things. There were attempts to try to work those out, and nothing came of it. Again, without a strong Congress to do that, without a strong executive to do that, those negotiations never really went anywhere. Thankfully, it doesn't erupt into any fighting or anything, but it could have, easily could have. And the inability to resolve the dispute makes them look weak as well. Well, all of this begs the question, well, why don't they just fix it? So we've got no money, we can't pay off our debts, we can't enforce our treaties, our states are squabbling with each other, we don't have any power to do anything, we're kind of falling apart at the seams here. Why don't we just change it? Why don't we just go in and fix the things that are wrong and make this better? Well, there were attempts to do that, but that brings up another problem. The amendment process, first of all, what is an amendment? If we make an amendment to something. Well, it could have the effect of one. It's a little bit bigger than just a law. Yes. So change it. Amend it means to change it, to add on and change it. But the amendment process is nearly impossible. It requires all states to agree with something. It has to be unanimous for them to agree for an amendment to actually happen. And what do you suppose is the likelihood that all 13 states would all agree to the exact same thing? Not very good. You can see why, they wanted it to be kind of difficult, We don't want, to just go in there and change it on a whim and just change it for crazy reasons. But they made it so hard that it just can't be, when they run into these problems, because everybody might agree, yeah, we got problems, but when you ask how do we fix it, there you get, a whole wide range of opinions about that. So that's why they're unable to fix a lot of this. So again, what we have within about 10 years is a country that is so weak that it cannot support itself hardly. Debts are not being paid. States are fighting with each other. And there are serious questions about how long can this go on and how long can we maintain our independence if we can't do such and such. And so what we'll look at tomorrow is kind of starting with the event that kind of convinced certainly not everybody, but at least enough people that we got to do something, and we can't keep going on like this. And if we keep with this, we're going to collapse into anarchy here. And then starting that process of originally trying to fix the articles, but what they'll eventually decide is just to do away with them and start over. All right, so we will start with that part of it tomorrow. Questions on that much?